So today is the Advaita Saptami, so the appearance day of Advaita Acharya, important event in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And there are several sources of information about the life of Advaita Acharya. While at the same time we refer primarily to Chaitanya Charitamrita and Chaitanya Bhagavat, and we use them largely in the way that, in a broader sense, we use the Bhagavatam, as explained by Jiva Goswami, to determine the veracity of other scriptural texts, or the extent to which they conform with Gaudiya Vaishnav's angle of vision that is there in the Bhagavatam. And to the extent that they do, of course, we accept them. To the extent that they don't, they become irrelevant to us while they have their own purpose. So in a similar way, Chaitanya Charitamrita, Chaitanya Bhagavat are kind of like a hub around which many texts written about the history of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his associates and so forth. They orbit around that hub, and we look to them. And if in other accounts, historical accounts, for example, we find contradictions, then we defer to those core texts. So that said, in the Advaita Paribar, there are three main texts that I've come in touch with that describe the Leela life of Advaita Acharya. And different dates are attributed to them. Probably the earliest one is Advaita Mangal. And I forget the name of the author, maybe Haricharan, Advaita Mangal. And that seems to be a 16th century text, so it would be, of the three, perhaps the earliest text. And then there is another text by a devotee named Lodhya Krishnadas, who is himself intertwined with the Leelas of Advaita Acharya that are described in all three of the books that I'm at the moment speaking about. And his book is called Balya Leela Sutra. So it's a short Sanskrit book that describes the childhood, the Balya Leela, the Kumar Leela of Advaita Acharya. And that seems to be an early text as well. The previous text that I mentioned, Advaita Mangal, is written in Bengali, and then the later text is Advaita Prakash. Well, forgive me, but the name of the author escapes me at the moment. This book is curious in that the consensus seems to be, not only amongst academics, but amongst devotees, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, for example, that the book is written much later, as late as the 19th century. But it's written by someone who is very familiar with how these type of texts, which are from an academic point of view called hagiographies, were written in the time that they were very popular, at the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, 15th, 16th century, and so forth. So I think it is for that reason that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur tended to dismiss it because it was presenting itself, the text, as if it had been written much earlier, and very well done in that regard, with in terms of conforming to that type of writing at that time, that type of Bengali at that time, and so on and so forth. But disingenuous in a sense, in that it was written much later. That doesn't necessarily mean that the content of the text is should be entirely dismissed. And in all three of the texts I mentioned, there are some accounts, anecdotal accounts that we find throughout them. And they don't necessarily conflict with the main texts that I mentioned, Chaitanya Charitamrita, Chaitanya Bhagavat, and some others in and around that time that discuss things about the associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So I'm going to refer to some of those leelas, some of which you may not be familiar with, and so therefore the source, and some of them many of you will be to one extent or another. But that said, it's clear that Advaita Acharya was a very, very powerful person in the eyes of the community of the time, the Gaudiya Vaishnava community. And prior to, if you will, a forming of a Gaudiya Vaishnava community, he was a very prominent and powerful person in the eyes of those who encountered him. He is, for the most part, said to have appeared in the world outside of Shantipur, where he's famously resided, and many leelas arise out of Shantipur. But in, I think it's called Shailet, I believe all three of these texts attribute that to the place of his birth, some miles away from Shantipur. And there, the area was presided over by a king of the village, who was a worshiper of the goddess Devi, some form of Devi. And Advaita's birth there, of course, is auspicious. There are stories of the visions of Sita Thakurani while bathing in the Ganga, that she would have an extraordinary child, relating them to her husband, and so forth, and him confirming similar dreams that he had, or visions, and so on and so forth. With the birth of Advaita Acharya and his, that being an auspicious event, being, somehow predicted and whatnot. The first instance in which, outside of his parents' experience, which is related, first instance in which his apparently spiritual power was came to the fore, and others took note of, was with regard to the king and the goddess, and the king's son, who was a playmate of Advaita, who at birth was named Kamalaksha. Kamalaksha means lotus eyes. That's a name for God. And the king and the king's son and Kamalaksha were playing as youths, and Advaita and the king's son apparently came into the temple. And there are different details in these different texts, but the gist of it is that the king's son insisted that Advaita should bow down as he had been taught to do before the goddess, but Kamalaksha refused to do so for reasons of his own. Boy, the king's son berated him for his lack of religiousness and so forth, and Advaita let out a sound, and the boy passed out as if dead on the scene, which then became a scene for everyone in the community. The king's son had died, it appeared, and to some extent at the and Advaita was involved in that, or Kamalaksha. So there was a big to-do about it, and Advaita or Kamalaksha made little of it. So just sprinkle some water from the puja on him, and he'll come back. He just fainted, that's all. And meanwhile, the subject as to the issue as to why Advaita refused to bow before the deity came to the fore, and his parents themselves were concerned about it. And there was some insistence that he should bow before the deity. And of course, he wouldn't bow before the deity because, he was the husband of the goddess in his own spiritual sensibilities, and one thing led to another. And he said, if I bow before the deity, then the deity will be destroyed. She'll destroy herself. And they've insisted that he do so, and the deity exploded on the scene. So these type of anecdotes, there are many of them throughout the life of Advaita as described in the different texts, but this was a huge event. Now, as I say, the details are different in different places, and we don't find the story particularly in the other texts, the main texts that I mentioned, which don't go into the details of Advaita's life, and they weren't compiled. Krishnadas Kaviraj's book and Vrindavan Das Thakur's book by members of the Advaita lineage who would be privy to all such details and so on and so forth. But the long and short of it is that the author that I mentioned of the Bali Leela Sutra in Sanskrit, Lodi Krishnadas is the new name of the king after he was initiated, and became a renunciate himself, which gives credence to the idea that Advaita had a powerful influence in his as Kamalaksha before he even became known as Advaita in his childhood, that had a profound effect on the king in the village in which he lived. And so much so that when Advaita and family relocated in Shantipur, at the insistence of Advaita, he wanted to live in Shantipur. So he had some, connection with the Dham, if you will. And upon relocating there, which was something that the king didn't want the family to do, but couldn't hold them back, the king eventually gave up his kingdom, became a servant of the Vaishnavas, and was initiated by the name Krishnadas, and he wrote the Bali Leela Sutra that I mentioned, short text on the early Kumar or Bali Leela of Advaita Charya. So the point being here that Advaita was a very powerful person even in his childhood, exhibited certain powers and whatnot that gave rise to faith in his spirituality and in Vaishnavism in general, which was what his spirituality was all about. So relocating in Shantipur, then we come to events like his schooling there. He had a teacher. All these texts refer to as by the name Shanta, who was very influential, and Advaita, of course, was his best student. He learned everything very quickly, and so on and so forth. And there is a miracle that is described in all these texts, or I think 2 out of 3 of them, in this regard. Not in the Bali Lila Sutra, because I don't think it includes his education. But that miracle, of course, is that, and some of you may be familiar with it, that there was a very beautiful lotus in a pond of lotuses that the king, or that the teacher wanted to, it really stuck out. He wanted to get it and make it part of an offering to the deity. But the lake was inhabited by many snakes, and so none of his students were courageous enough to venture into the lake to acquire the lotus, but Advaita volunteered, and of course he walked on the water, or on the lotuses. So he exhibited the Laghima Siddhi. Laghima is one of the Asta Siddhis, 8 mystic perfections of yoga, basically levitation. They said that Jesus walked on the water, and there are other accounts of such in the lives of different mystics and so forth. So again, the long and short of it here is that these stories are told, however accurate they may be in detail or not, they imply that Advaita had was a very powerful spiritual person, that his parents, political leaders, even in his childhood, his teacher and so forth, were awed by. And as a result, they began to identify him as an avatar. This would be the typical way in which persons of that time, living in the Puranic frame of reference, the sacred texts like the Puranas being the standard of knowledge, they would try to sort out whatever was happening, based on the accounts in the Puranas, what time it was, what yuga it was, if a powerful person was an avatar or not, and so on and so forth. So they identified Advaita as an avatar. Now, the main texts, and 2 of these texts from the Advaita line that I'm speaking about, they tend, and strongly so, to identifying him with the cosmic, if you will, figure of Mahavishnu, Shiva. Mahavishnu is considered to be Shiva and Vishnu together in some respects, the Sadashiva. Maha sometimes is said to refer to Shiva, and Vishnu, of course, to Vishnu, a very compassionate form of divinity, and the first avatar. Avatar means to descend, to come from up to down. So, we have the Krishna from our Gaudiya perspective. We have Krishna expands his ball around, the 2 expand as Vasudeva and Sankarshan for pastimes in Mathura and Vrindavan, and then they expand further as Narayan and Mahasankarshan in Vaikuntha, and from the Mahasankarshan comes the Mahavishnu. Now this is the first descent from the Paravyom, from the spiritual world, into time and space, if you will, and our frame of reference. And from Mahavishnu comes the Garbhodaksha, Vishnu, Shiradaksha, Vishnu, and so forth, and all the Leela avatars and Yuga avatars and whatnot all come through this Mahavishnu. So he's the original avatar. And the main text, and as I say, 2 of these other texts that I'm referring to, all identify him in terms of the Srishti Leela, the cosmos, the original avatar of all avatars. Remember, Krishna's the avatari of all avatars, but there's an original avatar as well, and that's Mahavishnu, original descent, primal descent. So as such, he is in the core text, and for that I would also refer to Kavi Karnapur and his Gauragana Dashtapika, but as well as I say in Chaitanya Charitamrita and in um, Chaitanya Bhagavat, he's identified in terms of sentiment and in terms of detail of what type of divinity, well, with Mahavishnu and the sentiment of Dasya Bhakti. Dasya Bhakti. This is very, very prominently brought out in Chaitanya Charitamrita in the 6th chapter of the Adi Lila, where there are 2 verses that Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami has penned, glorifying and describing something about Advaita. The chapter goes on, as I say, to glorify the virtues of Dasya Bhakti and underscore the fact that all forms of expressions of love for Krishna, properly understood, be it Sakya, Vatsalya, Madhurya, although they don't look like it per se necessarily, are all forms of service to Bhagavan. They don't look like it because it doesn't look like service for Mother Yasoda to chastise her son and tie him up, for Krishna's friends to wrestle him to the ground, for Radha not to let him in when she's angry with him. And that doesn't look like service to Bhagavan. So you have to look very closely. These are the main subjects of the Bhagavatam. Bhagavatam says you have to look very closely and pay close attention to understand it. Nasta prayeshu abhadreshu nityam bhagavata sevaya. So, but there in that chapter, the 6th chapter of Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's a short chapter, and it again elaborates on the 2 original verses of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, but the entire elaboration is on the virtues of Dasya Bhakti and the fact that that everyone acknowledges and even pursues or desires the role of servitude in one form or another, and including Mahavishnu wants to be a servitor. Ekalar Ishvara Krishna are subverted. What to speak of all the Tatastha Jivas, even the different forms of the Godhead and the primal avatar himself, Mahavishnu desires such. And of course, Krishna himself, the avatari, also, and this is very much what Gaudiya Vaishnavism is about, desires to take the role of a servant of himself. In this case, to experience himself through the serving disposition, which is extreme, of Srimati Radhika. Someone once complained that I had said that Radharani was a sadhu. I gave a reference to the Bhagavatam. It's well referenced. Krishna refers there to the gopis' love as being like that of sadhus, saintly, and for him to repay it, well, he'd have to become a saint himself, and that's the famous verse of the Bhagavatam in the Rasa Lila, which is esoterically speaking the genesis of the Chaitanya avatar. So, at any rate, the virtues of service, the virtue of being a devotee by whom the Godhead is ultimately controlled. That comes to the fore to the largest extent in Krishna Lila, because of the measure of the devotion there, the power it has over Bhagavan to turn him into a child, turn him into a friend, to turn him into a lover, and so on and so forth. That said, there are many other ideas, thoughts, considerations as to the position of Advaita in terms of who he is beyond appearing as Advaita, what kind of avatar he is, or what is his sentiment. And because Gaudiya Vaishnavism is really all about Braj Bhakti, some of these core texts, I think Advaita Mangal in particular, Advaita Mangal in particular, probably the earliest of them, has identified him in other ways with the Braj Leela, not doing away with the cosmic identity of Advaita as Mahavishnu and his Dasya Bhakti, but also placing him, for example, in the Braj Leela. There he's placed in the Braj Leela as Ujjwal Sakha, the friend of Krishna, and other places are given to him as well. Sometimes he's referred to as Gopishwar, Mahadev, the form of Shiva who resides in Vrindavan, and so on and so forth. So there's an attempt there to connect him with that, but we don't find that in the core text. It's fairly prominent in the Advaita Vamsa and Paribar to try to do that. I don't think really it's necessary. Someone might raise the question, and I've heard it before. Well, Advaita is Mahavishnu. How can he give, Braj Bhakti? Well, I wouldn't worry about that and have to come up with some identity of Advaita in Braj in order for that to be possible. Because after all, and we have to get to that, he's the one who brought Chaitanya to the world, Krishna to the world as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Of course, we can say that he brought him there largely in terms of his role as the Yuga avatar. That's true, which is the outer side of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. What about the inner side and the inner reason for his coming, which has everything to do with Braj Bhakti and so forth? Well, yes, Advaita brought him for that purpose of the Yuga avatar. And when that purpose was finished, in Jagannath Puri, it was Advaita who gave the blessing to Mahaprabhu. Now that's done. Your work as the Yuga avatar is done. You have set in motion the Yuga Dharma. Now you can give full attention to the inner purpose for which you came. So that only came with the blessings of Advaita. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu could not pursue the inner life, so to speak, that he came to experience unencumbered by the necessity of establishing Dharma and whatnot without the blessing of Advaita. And for that matter, going forward in the Leela of Advaita Charja, in his adolescence, he goes on pilgrimage. And of course, he goes to Vrindavan. And famously there in Vrindavan, Advaita the deity of Madan Gopal, he was actually a deity that had one of the deity that had been crafted under the direction of the grandson of Krishna, and had been the deity also worshipped by Kubja in Mathura. This deity of Madan Gopal manifest himself before Advaita by way of, I think, appearing in a dream and telling him, I'm over here in the bush, something like that, because of the Muslim influence coming in Vrindavan, which in many instances involved desecrating temples and so forth, and caused the pujaris to move the deities into secret places and so on and so forth. So Advaita was informed by the deity in a dream of his whereabouts along the banks of the Jamuna. He came and he had the power, Advaita, to arouse the villagers sufficiently to go and dig and uncover the brush in that area to honor the dream of Advaita. So he had that kind of a power that he could collect the faith and energy and work of the people. And sure enough, it was fruitful. They found the deity, and Advaita worshipped the deity. But the deity then came in a dream to him again and said, such and such Brahmin I'm going to send here. I want you to give the deity to him, and he will worship him. I have my own plans for this. And while Advaita, of course, would acquiesce to the plan of Krishna, Madan Gopal in the dream, he lamented the loss, and he was told in another dream that you may know that at one time in Krishna Leela, Vishaka Devi, who was probably the closest friend of Radhika, born on the same day as her, had drawn a picture of Krishna, maybe using like hibiscus for ink and some leaf as a paper, a picture of modern Gopal or of Krishna, and gave it to Radharani to solace her in her feelings of love and separation for Krishna. And Advaita was told that painting can be found at such and such a place. So he found it, and he was to worship the painting and take that back to Shantipur in West Bengal. Later, it became then, and Advaita had something to do with this, the deity of Madan Gopal or Madan Mohan, the worshipful deity of Sanatan Goswami. So he came under the charge of the Seva Puja of that deity. That's a famous story in itself, out of which, of course, the Madan Mohan temple was eventually built. But here, I bring this up, of course, it's a significant and interesting Leela, but Advaita in the role Mahavishnu, the cosmic avatar, in the role of a devotee, has a connection with the Braj Leela worship of Krishna, Radha and Krishna, and so on and so forth. So I don't think there's a necessity to find some Braj identity of Advaita, so on and so forth. We don't have to worry. I wouldn't if I was in the Advaita Vamsa. And I think, for that matter, who is it? The Guru, Diksha Guru of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, our Gaur Kishore Das Babaji Maharaj came in Advaita Paribar. And so, at any rate, Advaita was a great worshiper of Radha and Krishna. He was eventually initiated, and there are different accounts of how and where that happened, but initiated by Madhavendra Puri, and he expressed a deep concern, of course, for the condition of the world and the desire to establish Gaudiya Vaishnavism and the virtues of Harinam and so forth, which weren't well understood by the people in general. And as such, he wanted to bring Krishna himself to the world, if you will. Somebody asked me not long ago, do you really think that Mahavishnu, if he came to the world, he couldn't liberate the world? He'd have to bring Krishna, and on this basis, he couldn't believe, if you will, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I explained to him that these stories have a meaning to them, have a purpose to them, and they're worth embracing literally. But if your mind doesn't allow you to, you have to gravitate towards the implications of them. And of course, the implication is very clear in terms of Advaita bringing Krishna to the world. His purpose is largely in the context of the Leela to establish that he himself, Mahavishnu, if you will, is a servant of Krishna. This is a Bhagavatam Leela. There's a very famous Leela in the Bhagavatam in which Mahavishnu is said to have stolen the sons of a Brahmin, and the Kshatriyas couldn't do anything about it. They didn't know where the sons were going. They were disappearing. And Arjuna came in and vowed that he would stop this from happening or give up his life as a proud Kshatriya. And he couldn't stop it. And he was about to take his life. And Krishna took him to Mahavishnu, who there were the sons. And he explains there that he performed this Leela to get Krishna and Arjuna together to come before him, that he would pay obeisances to them. It's a famous story. I'm just giving it very, very much in brief, but it's right in the Bhagavatam itself. And the implication of that is, again, the same thing, that Mahavishnu, it's the central core piece of philosophy in Gaudiya Vaishnava. Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam. Krishna is the source of all avatars. And I explained, when I was in Madhavan recently, I was emphasizing this point because we were discussing the Brahma Vimohan Leela. in which Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swayam is the main point of tattva that comes out of that Leela. Krishna shows himself to Brahma to be the source of all worlds and all the Mahavishnus and all the Brahmas and so on and so forth. Just to refer back to what I've said then about that, it's very important that Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swayam, because if Krishna is not the source of Mahavishnu, then he doesn't have his own world. He's a phase of Mahavishnu who's only served in Dasya Bhakti or Shanta Bhakti. So there's no eternal Sakya Rasa, Vatsalya Rasa, Madhurya Rasa, which, if there is, requires an abode that's different from Vaikuntha. That's the Maha-Vaikuntha or Goloka. So it's important to us that to establish Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swayam. Otherwise, we don't have an ideal that it exists in eternity. We're confused, would be the perspective. So we labor hard, or the Goswamis have, and well reasoned, well scripturally supported, has been their effort to establish that Krishna is the source of Mahavishnu, but and all avatars. And this is one Leela in the Bhagavatam where Jiva Goswami refers to, for example, in Krishna Sandarbha, which is all about this point, Krishna's Tu Bhagavan Swayam. So we go from the Bhagavatam, Srimad Bhagavatam, to its natural extension, the Chaitanya Bhagavat, or the Bhagavat in Encore Leela of Krishna Leela, appearing in Navadvip, and for a number of exoteric and esoteric reasons. The exoteric reasons, even themselves, being esoteric from an ordinary point of view. But there are parallel Leelas, of course, which help us to draw that connection. And this is one of them. The Mahavishnu wants to establish that he himself is a servant of Krishna. That position is more desirable to him, that bhava, than to be the Lord of the whole cosmic manifestation. And as we know, well, Advaita did bring Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the world, and having done so, he labored hard to establish that that he was but the avatar, if you will, of Krishna, who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is not different from. We will maybe go into that Leela a little bit, but in the verse of Krishna's Kavya is one of them. The name of Advaita Acharya is given, Advaita and Acharya. And there are a couple of reasons, 3 reasons that Kamalaksha became known as Advaita. And the Acharya follows. The Acharya is obvious because he was a great teacher of bhakti, and he taught by his example. Acharya means, behavior. And Acharya is one who teaches and must teach not only in precept, but by example, which the latter of which speaks louder than precept, as we know. So Advaita was an extraordinary sage and rishi. He was born probably around 1436, I believe. So he was 50 or 52 years old before Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was born. And all those years he lived as an ascetic, a mystic, and living along. He had a place in Shantipur and also in Navadvip, living along the bank of the Ganges, and living an austere and devotional life. In which the puja was the puja of the Shalagram and Madan Gopal, the picture, offered tulsi and Ganga Jal, water from the Ganga. And so he was a great acharya by his example. He would teach, he gave seminars on the Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad Gita, and consistently over and over again extol the virtues of bhakti over gyan, bhakti over gyan, bhakti over gyan. This was his default, if you will, and an important emphasis within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So he was an acharya, very clearly. The name Advaita, it's said that during his earlier life, a great Pandit came to Shantipur, heard of his virtues, wanted to debate with him, and the goddess presiding over his learning, the Pandit's learning, revealed to him in the course of debating with and meeting with Advaita that Advaita was an avatar himself, and referred to him as Advaita. So that is one place from where the name Advaita comes. The scholar told the story, celebrated it. Kamalaksha began to be referred to as Advaita. But he's also referred to as Advaita because Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami explains he is non-different from Krishna. That means he is Vishnu Tattva. So he's different emotionally, and has a different Leela and so forth, but he's one in Tattva. So they're one. And there's another reason, the third reason that he's referred to as Advaita, and that is because he made the two one. That means he caused Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to come, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the combined form of Radha and Krishna. So he's thought to bring the two together for a special descent, the exoteric purpose of which is to establish Nam Dharma in the world and set that in motion. The esoteric purpose of which is for Krishna to fully enter into the sentiment of Radha and understand himself, experience himself from her perspective, and thus experience the fullest measure of rasa. After all, he's Rasa Raj. He should be able to do that. And seeing the measure of her experience of rasa exceeded his, well, this brought about a kind of an existential crisis for him, as I've referred to in the past. So the Krishna avatar, that's going on in the background. Advaita is in the foreground. Now, in Advaita's life as an acharya and teacher, he had some very important students. And relevant to what we're discussing, the subject, the student of Haridas Thakur comes up. So Haridas was born around 1450, so he's a little younger than Advaita and older than Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He was, of course, born in a Muslim family. The story is that he only drank milk, and he wandered away from home and happened into the ashram of Advaita, who recognized him beyond Haridas's ability to recognize himself and what he was doing there and where he'd come from. And he referred to him as Brahma Haridas. He gave him the name Haridas and referred to him as Brahma Haridas, and saw him as the Brahma of the Brahma Vimohan Leela, who had appeared on earth to assist him and to some extent to make up for any perception or any possibility of offense on his part in the Brahma Vimohan Leela. There, he tried to exercise his power over Krishna and his friends, and it didn't work out so well for him, but in the long run, of course, it did. And it was Krishna's arrangement, but he could be looked at as having interfered with Krishna's picnic. Yeah, he did. Of course, we're glad that he did, because what we learned from that. But then again, in his own mind, gosh, I interfered with Krishna's picnic. I have to make up for that. So he's identified by Advaita as that Brahma who appeared in the Brahma Vimohan Leela, taking birth as a Muslim to make up. That's the offense. Of course, he's a Muslim, but he only drank milk, and in his early childhood, he left home and became a student of Advaita. So not only became a student of Advaita, but a very prominent student. And there are probably the most celebrated story therein is, can you hear me? Hello? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
I'm hoping that I haven't been looking to see if everything is, because we've had bad connections. I think we solved the problem, so hopefully it's all gone well. Give me your, Yes.
Yes, it's going wonderfully.
Okay, good. So the Brahman story of Brahma Haridas is worth relating, and that is, of course, that Advaita was a very orthodox Brahmin, and so they had a very tight Brahminical community. And during a puja in a Shraddha ceremony that he was performing, in which the prasad would be given to the best Brahmin in the community, Advaita gave it to Haridas, and all the Brahmins became enraged because he was an outcast in their minds. So they didn't understand Vaishnavism, and they thought Brahmanism was a superior, the Varnashram was a superior religious path. And to attain Brahmanhood, if you will, was more progressive, spiritually and auspicious than to be a Vaishnava. So, of course, they went home, and then they couldn't light their fires, and sacrificial fires, and so they came back, and they knew there's something wrong, and then they forget. Then they paid obeisance to Haridas, and they could start their fires. So it's an interesting story because it's prior to the appearance of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and after his appearance, of course, this was one of his main points. He made Haridas his namacharya. He made Rup Sanatan, who were outcasts from the Hindu community because of their being employed in the Muslim government. Brahmins are not to take any kind of employment. They became outcasts, but they became the main theologians of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's selection or order. So it's a prominent aspect of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Vaishnavism, and this aspect of it precedes Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself in the form of Advaita's embrace of Haridas Thakur. While Advaita then worshipped the Shalagram with Tulsi and Ganga Jal with a desire to bring Krishna to the world, Chaitanya Charitamrita mentions that Haridas was doing the same thing through his Nam Bhajan. He had this kind of sankalpa, this kind of wish, right, that was embedded in his chant, this kind of aspiration. And Advaita had the same aspiration in regard to his puja. The puja would be like Vaidhi Marg and the Nam Bhajan Rag Marg. So both together they brought him, and he came with two purposes. For the Vidhi Marg purpose of establishing the Yuga Dharma, and the Rag Marg purpose, as we've said already, of tasting the bhav, experiencing the bhav of Radha. The principal method by which to do so, of course, is the Nam Bhajan, exemplified by Haridas, who was initiated by Advaita. So if Haridas could have a significant role in bringing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the world, and that with regard to the esoteric purpose of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that corresponds with his type of bhajan, as opposed to Advaita and his type of bhajan, which would correspond more to the Yuga Dharma aspect of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. If Brahma Haridas could do that, well, we have to look back and see, well, yes, he could. And he was initiated by Advaita. So again, I wouldn't be worried if I was in the Advaita Vamsa. I don't think too many people are, but he has the power. The point is to give Braj Bhakti. And again, Haridas, of course, came to play a very important role in Chaitanya Lila. It's said in the Advaita Mangal that when Advaita Acharya gave the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra to Advaita, when Advaita gave it to Brahma Haridas, as we here referred to him, he explained to him that the 32 syllables of the Hare Krishna mantra represent, and the names are given there, 17 gopis and 15 gopas. So here we have, in the conception, if you will, according to Advaita Mangala, of Haridas Thakur, a nice combination of these two friendly sentiments. Sakya and Madhurya are compatible, highly compatible with one another. None of the other prominent sentiments, principal sentiments, Shanta, Dasya, or Vatsalya, are compatible with Madhurya or with Sakya. And these two, Sakya and Madhurya, are compatible. I've written a nice article about this. I had mentioned it in my last day in Madhuvan, the influence of Sakya on Madhurya. I finished that article recently, and it's quite interesting, and some of the points that it raises that probably many people who like to extol the virtues of Manjari Bhav are unfamiliar with. I feel like nowadays, when I see something, someone pops up somewhere and wants to remind us that Manjari Bhav is the highest thing, I feel like saying, yes, it's right. We need to cleanse our heart. That's right. We need to control our mind and senses. Just a side point there. But anyway, we seeing Brahma as, or Haridas as Brahma and his connection with the Brahma Bhimohan Leela, and we trace out the history of Brahma as I've done in my book, Circled Friends, then we identify him also with Sakya Rasa. So the idea that he was taught by Advaita to see these two as compatible and have a mixed form himself, if you will, or of such sentiment, like an Armasaka, we could say, is something worth bringing out. So with Brahma, Haridas as arguably his main, one of his main students. Advaita fathered a number of sons. He married Sita and her sister, and there are many nice stories about Sita and her divinity and her sister, and they're identified with both with Yogamaya, Purnamasi, with his marriage in place, which took place at a much later time in his life. He got married at 50 or 52 on the order of someone I forget, or based on some impulse from within. And of course, then he united with his consort, eternal consort, as we understand it, fathered children, and some of them became prominent in representing the line in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But with this in place, marriage, children, Haridas initiated, and so on and so forth, ultimately Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appears. So that was 1486, and that would make it way to about 50 or 50, about 50 years old. So it's said that he would again worship the Shalagram with Tulsi and Ganga Jal on the bank of the Ganga, and that on one such occasion, his offering of flowers and Tulsis went on their own course down the Ganga, I guess from Shantipur to Navadvip, as it's heading towards the Bay of Bengal, and lo and behold, Sachi Devi was bathing at the time, and the Tulsi leaves stuck to her abdomen within a room, while within a room was Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and she couldn't get him off, and so it became a concern to her husband, and they were Advaita was known to them. He was prominent in the time, prominent enough sage in the whole area that they went to him, and he expressed his pleasure and told that something very auspicious would occur. This was, of course, after she had already given birth to Vishvarup, her other son, and had prior to that, Vishwarup's birth, many miscarriages. All of these things were explained to her and her husband by Advaita, and their position, which they thought was less than auspicious, was shown to them to be very auspicious. The father and mother of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Vishwambar, as they named him, and Vishwarup, his older brother. Sachi became a worshipper of Krishna and Balaram. It's described in Chaitanya Bhagavat that she had the Krishna and Balaram deities there that she worshipped, and those were her sons, and she is Yashoda, and so on and so forth. So Advaita played a prominent role in this, bringing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the world, and largely, in one sense, yes, I need to bring Krishna to the world to save everyone. Everyone's so fallen, even I cannot do it. But really, in essence, what he wanted to do was establish Krishna's two, Bhagavan Swayam, and that the Goloka Vrindavan exist, and that the doors to this place have been opened. And Advaita is open doors. How can we not but say he's the best of Mahaprabhu's associates? When we give a lecture on Nityananda Prabhu, then we'll give the reasons why he's the best, or on Gadadhar why he's the best, and they are all the best. But Advaita is best known for his service prior to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's appearance, laying the groundwork and so forth, bringing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the world, and then he played a prominent role within that period of time. And again, what should be highlighted there is that with his permission in Jagannath Puri, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was allowed to move, if you will, from a public figure to a private figure. We say it was by the force of how he conducted himself as a public figure in Nam Sankirtan, preaching, explaining the theology and so forth, as he did throughout the subcontinent of India. But also with the blessing that Advaita brought him for his public purposes, of establishing Vaishnavism and the Yuga Dharma, and he said, "Now it's done. You can retire from that." And this thing coincides with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu entering into his Anti-Lila, becoming a private person, unable to really function as a public figure any longer. Such is the power of conducting oneself publicly in a way that doesn't contradict how one conducts oneself privately. So his private life and his public life were one, and they were extremely devotional. And the method to his eventual madness, of course, was Nam Sankirtan. And with Advaita's blessing, he entered into that final aspect of his life, whereby he successfully will accomplish his internal mission to experience himself from Radha's position, and show us, the way to enter into the Vrindavan Leela, the Navadvipa Leela, the Vrindavan Leela. So these are a few thoughts on the virtues of Advaita Charya, his contribution, and what's the time? And we're just about out of time. So I can't see the suns in my face. Hope you can see me well. It's a beautiful morning here. Everything's good. I had a couple of falls the other day. I'm a little sore from that. From a cow, one of our cows accidentally pushed me over and fell with me. And but all's good, and it's good talking with you about this. Are there any questions or comments?
I have a question,
Yes.
Gumaraj. My question is there anything more you could say on how the 32-syllable Mahamantra contains the names, I guess, names of 17 gopis and 15 gopas?
Well, I'm just, there's no other reference for that I'm aware of, but I bring it up because it's there in the Advaita Mangal, and it's It's in relation to, as I mentioned, Advaita initiating Haridas, giving him the mantra. Incidentally, Advaita also became the initiating guru of Sachi, whose son wouldn't drink her milk from her breast until he was initiated. But there's nothing else mentioned in that text. There's no, it's just stated. But fair enough to say that this Mahamantra can be applied effectively to the pursuit of Sakya Rasa or Madhurya Rasa, and what to speak of a form of Sakya Rasa that's influenced by Madhurya Rasa, and what to speak of Jiva Goswami's position, which I wrote about in the article I referred to. His position is that the Madhurya Rasa of Vrindavan gopis is mixed with Sakya Rasa. So I don't have anything more that I can share with you. I had never heard that before. I saw it. I have an edition of Advaita Mongol. I saw it, and I was surprised to see that. Hadn't remembered that. I had seen it years ago, I guess. But I think in a broader sense, it's a way of saying that. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. If anybody else has a question, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Swami, where are we going to see this article you said about that you wrote? Is that coming out in the Harmonist?
Could you hear Pranada's question?
No.
Okay, you did click on English, Pranada.
I'm on a phone, Archana. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, so she just wanted to know about the article that you talked about, when it would be coming out on the Harmonist.
Oh, well, I've written it as a final appendix to my book. It seemed like a fitting end. So it won't be coming out on the Harmonist before it comes out in my book. It's about Sakya Mishra Bhakti of Braj, as per the vision of Jiva Goswami. And I've tried to, he doesn't explain that, but he states it clearly, that the gopis, Madhurya Rasa in Braj is mixed with Sakya. And he states that in a section of his Priti Sandarbha, in which he's also explaining other mixed forms of rasa, like Balarams, like Yudhishthir's, and so forth. These are types of mixtures of rasas or emotional sentiments, in which one is prominent and the devotee is defined by that, but the others, one other or two others, are there as well. In all of Rupa Goswami refers to this as Sankul Bhav. Jiva Goswami does not invoke that term. Rupa Goswami does not give examples of what he would call Sankul Bhav as a mixture of Sakya and Madhurya. But Jiva Goswami, without invoking the term and citing the same examples that Rupa Goswami cites of Sankul Bhav, ends that section by saying, in the gopis of Braj, the Lakshmis or the queens of Dwarka have Madhurya mixed with Dasya, and the gopis of Braj have Madhurya mixed with Sakya. So it's very clear what he's saying there. He's talking about not a temporary mixture, but he's talking about a permanent sentiment in which Madhurya is prominent and Sakya is secondary. And so sometimes this the secondary will play itself out as it does in Balaram's life, sometimes as a servant, sometimes as a superior, but prominently as a friend. So with the gopis, prominently as a lover, but sometimes as a friend. And there are different ways to think about that. So I've written about it in different from different angles of vision. And ultimately, I've given an example from the Leela to support Jiva Goswami. That doesn't mean to say there aren't other opinions, and it's certainly not opinion that I know of is voiced by anyone else. So it's curious and interesting, but it's not my opinion. It's Jiva Goswami's opinion, and so I sought to give some support to that. And in the context of doing it, just kind of lay out briefly the extent to which Sakya Rasa plays a role in the Madhurya Rasa of the gopis, and it's quite considerable. And you know, part of the reason I did this is because I repeatedly hear these characterizations of Madhurya Rasa and Sakya Rasa that are very unfortunately very mundane. Even they may be accurate in terms of what's being said, the spirit behind them is very mundane. It's very like a competitive kind of thing. One's better than the other. This one's good. This one's bad. This one's the best because this. It just doesn't have anything to do with what Braj is really all about. And so I thought it would be useful. People have criticized just the fact that I wrote a book about Sakya Rasa. Say, what does that have to do with Gaudiya Vaishnavism? Well, they might be surprised to find out that it has quite a bit to do with Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And hopefully it's not, you know, this one's better than that one, but I mean, these are the people that are the dearest devotees that one could possibly be to Krishna, Krishna's friends, Krishna's lovers. You have to tread very delicately when speaking about them. And Prabhupada was very much emphasized this point, and his part of his unwillingness to talk about it in detail derives from that it might just become this, you know, my team is better than your team kind of thinking. And for that matter, Sanatana Goswami makes very clear as an extension on this point in his Brihad Bhagavatamrita that these determinations of higher and lower with regard to service to Bhagavan is all relative to the material world for sadhana, to inspire people in sadhana. It doesn't have any application in the spiritual world itself. No one thinks like that there. No one feels like that there. It doesn't exist there, higher and lower, in that sense. But for teaching, then it may be useful. So, what else? Another question?
Archana, can you ask him one more
No.
question for me?
Ranada has another question. Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
So he said Mahavishnu can give
What is it?
She's
Yeah.
Vraja
asking it.
Prema. He said Mahavishnu can give Vraja Prema. Is that something specific to Gaura Leela, or can any of the Vishnus give Krishna Prema?
So you had said that Mahavishnu can give Krishna Prema or Vraj Prema. So is that
Well, I
specific?
said that Advaita can.
Advaita can. So is that, so she wanted to know if that's specific to, what was it?
To Gaura Leela,
Was that
to
specific
Gaura Leela
Gaura
or-
Leela or
if
Yeah.
other Vishnus could give that?
can
Obviously,
other
Mahavishnu-
Vishnus also give
Obviously,
that?
Mahavishnu is not giving, you know, he's not the deity of Braj Bhakti. So people are worshiping him with Aishvarya and so on and so forth. I mean, he is Aishvarya. Just look at him, four-armed and so on and so forth. You know, universe is emanating from the pores of his body, as he's described. So it couldn't get more of an overt form of Aishvarya than Mahavishnu. So, but Mahavishnu is not giving Braj Bhakti, but in the form of Advaita, he is taking advantage of the opportunity presented by Krishna's internal pursuit to appear in the world as a devotee of Krishna or Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And you know, it would be hard to be more connected to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu than Advaita. So in that form, as Advaita, certainly he can give Braj Bhakti. He's involved in Braj Bhakti. He's worshiping Madan Gopal. Hope that answers the question. Anything else?
Good morning, Guru Maharaj. It's Kanaram here. Can I ask you something?
Yes.
You mentioned that Advaita Acharya had two wives, and Sita, of course, is a pretty famous. We hear a little something about her. Can you tell us a little more about the second wife?
That's her sister. And not as much has been said, other than that I can't even, and forgive me, it's most offensive on my part. I can't remember her name at the moment, but I've been forgetting names of late, more than I'm accustomed to. So me for that, but she's considered to be also a manifestation of Yogamaya, but Sita is very prominent. So more attention has been given to her, but there are some stories about her, her sister's divinity and so forth, but they're eclipsed by the divinity of Sita Thakurani. So there's not much that comes to my mind at the moment that I can relate to, but thank you for your question.
Padmanabha Swami mentioned her name is Shri. You may have seen that.
Shri,
Thank you.
I thought there was another name as well. Shri, I know that name, but maybe that is the only name she goes by. Shri Devi Ki Jai.
Jai.
Jai, Haribol.
Sita Thakurani Ki Jai.
So I just have a quick question for you, Gumaraj. Next Monday, you'll be giving a talk on Nityananda.
Is it Monday or Sunday?
Yeah, it's. I think it's on Monday that they're.
It's a
Okay.
Monday, Guru Maharaj.
I'll be there.
So will you be giving questions and answers on Sunday also? That would be the question, so we can let everyone know on the call. If
Yeah, I think we should be able to do that. The internet seemed to work this time, so.
that's great. Yeah, it was much, much better than it's been. So
Good.
really grateful.
Okay,
So thank you so much for that.
all right.
A wonderful class, and everybody, we'll see everyone soon. Hare Krishna.
Haribol.
Hare Bo.